Namaskar and welcome to Sathology, Debunking Mythology. We have very, very special guests. One of the last videos of his you liked very much, most of you, and you had also subscribed and asked that he should come well be welcome again with more content. He's a writer, he's an author, he's a leader in one of the very big organizations in India and Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, and he's a great friend. So today we have chosen a topic on the business of halal certification. It's a huge business, and sometimes it doesn't meet the religious needs of many people outside the community, but it's a huge business. And so we would like to discuss with him and find out what is it, and also learn from him. So without delay, let us welcome Sri Arun Anand.
Namaskar, and thank you so much for calling me again. And as and I, it's always a pleasure to be here and to interact with all of you. So first I'll come to because we are talking to largely the crowd which is there in US. So I'll just give you some basic statistics first about what is happening in US as our host and my dear friend have said that halal certification is a big business. Uh, and you have to keep in mind that it's off on the record now that there is a nexus between halal certification and terrorism.
No, we can hear you.
Yeah. And let's first look at the Western Hemisphere. For example, 60% of the halal food trade in the France is done by those bodies which are linked to Muslim Brotherhood. Similarly, the Canadian halal certification body, which is named as the Muslim Association, has already been accused of providing financial support to the terrorist organization Hamas. Now let's come to Crescent Foods, the leading US company, which sponsors programs for two institutions that issues halal certificates. That is the Council for American Islamic Relations, which is also known as the acronym is CAIR, and the Islamic Society of North America, ISNA or ISNA. Ahmad Adam, the president of Crescent Foods, is a Palestinian Arab American and is also a founding member of the Islamic Society of North America. In 2000, in year 2000, both these Islamic institutions sent 12 million US dollars to Hamas. And then there are a number of other individuals and this thing. So Pakistan, which has been one of the key funders of terrorism, so they also have the they are under they have brought an amendment in their constitution. So halal certification is compulsory there. So they earn millions of dollars through it and then root it broadly. That is one of the key areas of funding of terrorism. And you'll have to go back a little bit. This we call it halalonomics. This halal trade and economy, it was always there among the Muslim countries, but it was never organized and structured till 1945 when Muslim Judicial Council Halal Trust was established in the South African capital Cape Town. Now this institution still exists and has been promoting proliferation and larger networking of halal. After this council came into being, interestingly, the halal registration began only in Thailand in 1969, but that also was largely through the export of poultry products from their country to Kuwait. Now, the original initiation of a well thought out and planned Islamic centric trade, industry, commerce, and economy was from the Southeast Asian Muslim country of Malaysia. The Department of Islamic Development Malaysia, which is JAKIM, was established there in 1974. It was the first country in the world which made a law defining halal trade. The pace of this process was so rapid that by 1980, efforts were made to make Malaysia the global halal hub. Currently, the network of Department of Islamic Development Malaysia is spread across 45 countries, and a total of 78 halal registration institutions are associated with it. There are three major institutions of India also associated with it: Halal India, Jamaat Ulema Halal Foundation, and Jamaat Ulema Hind Halal Trust. Now, what happens is that in Islam, broadly, all the deeds, it is not only about the food. All the activities, all the deeds, all the products, they have been broadly classified into two categories. One is the halal, second is haram. Halal are those which are allowed, and haram are those which are not allowed. And when, uh, especially, it comes to food items largely. So we have seen that uh, the non-Muslim population generally prefers not to have a basically halal certified products, but companies are paying millions and millions of dollars to non-governmental organizations, which are giving them, these non-governmental Muslim organizations or Islamic organizations, which are giving them halal certificate that okay, it can be used by the Muslims, and all of us are basically consuming that. So whether the soap which you are using, the cosmetics which you are using, the food items which you are using, the juices which you are drinking. So if you would see, most of them would be halal certified, and it's a parallel economy worth trillions and trillions of dollars, which has been going on. So I think that is largely, the expanse of the uh, whole this thing. I would suggest that you read two reports. You must read two reports if you want to know more about it. One is the State of Global Islamic Economy Report 2019. I'm repeating, the State of Global Islamic Economy Report 2019. It is published by Dinar Standard, DINAR, Dinar Standard. The So you must read basically this report, and there are some other reports also published by Dinar Standard, which you can read. And to to round up this first answer to the first question, or answer to the first point, I'll just give you the halal, where right now the halal trade is growing by leaps and bounds. It's Middle Asia, Pacific Asia, Northern Europe, East, South America, Bahrain, Australia, Canada, India, Albania, Iran, Brunei, Afghanistan, Brazil, France, Iraq, Thailand, Azerbaijan, Guyana, Germany, Jordan, China, Bangladesh, USA, Italy, Kuwait, Indonesia, Kazakhstan, Switzerland, Lebanon, Malaysia, Kyrgyzstan, United Kingdom. So, and then you have East South America, you have Oman, Singapore, Maldives, Turkey, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Russia, Syria, Sri Lanka, UAE, Tajikistan, Yemen, Turkestan, and Uzbekistan. So virtually almost covering the whole world. So this is what is happening on the front of the halal trade.
No, great and great information to our viewers. I think many of them are surprised. Now, because in US this makes doesn't make up the news at all in the national media. Now, coming back to the point that you mentioned, one point, the non-Muslim, especially Hindu communities and Buddhist communities, they cannot consume those products because they've already been offered to somebody, so they cannot offer it to their deities. So, what is the other issues that the Hindus may face in their religious duties by using these kind of products?
See, the other issue is largely, first and foremost, I think not only in terms of Hindus, but most importantly, why these companies are not putting warnings in bold on their products that this is basically a halal certified product. And also, so they are, and the companies are not producing, most of these companies are not producing non halal, they are not producing non halal products. So the consumer is not given a choice. Now, and then when it comes to, the other considerations of Hindus or non-Muslims, especially in India. So, for example, you take the case of Sikhs. Now, the meat which they eat, it has to be jhatka. That is basically, the animal has to be, whose meat they are eating, so it has to be killed in one go. Whereas in halal, it's gradually killed, to put it, in layman's language. So, eating halal meat is not permissible at all to Sikhs and the non-Hindus also, the Hindus also, who are meat eaters. But they are eating all the time basically the meat which is the halal certified meat, and which is not a jhatka. So it goes diametrically opposite to whatever their whatever is allowed in their religion, or whatever is allowed, whatever they are allowed. and they are doing it. Most interesting thing is that, and it's ironical also, that they are doing it most of the time unintentionally. I think if these things are specified, then the consumption of the halal products, would go down dramatically, and especially in countries which claim to be secular. Now there are countries, which are Islamic theocracies, so there one can still understand that, okay, all the products have to be halal certified. But the countries which claim to be secular, and which are not a theocratic state, which are democracies, elected democracies, so it is very sad to see that the governments have buckled down under the pressure, and it is across the board. It is across the board. It is not only about one country, and I'm not surprised, that in USA also people don't talk about it much, because the corporates, they have, come together to ensure that no one talks about it much. So you would see, interestingly, if you go to any of the online platforms and see, that you would hardly find even books on issues like this. But we were able to put together a research team and, cull out some very interesting facts about this, which I'm sharing.
So another important thing, I think the reason you just mentioned about the US is largely because of media. But privately, there is a lot of concern because many of the Jews don't use a kosher food they consume, and these people have halal food. What is the alternative for India? Is it like a dharmic food or vegetarian food? What is the option?
See, the option is basically that one. Uh, but before I go to that, I'll tell you another interesting aspect. I don't have the uh, data for the US right now, but for India, I have the data that one of the organizations which gives halal certificate, and whose role in supporting the active terrorists or terror elements, in several cases, has been paying them on an average per annum, if I say in the US terms, 1.4 million Indian rupees. And you can, and there are hundreds of companies, and this is on year renewal basis, and for, certification of their products. So you can imagine the amount of money which these organizations are making in India, and if you extrapolate that to US, you can imagine the amount of money which they would be making there. But no, another important thing is, as you rightly said, the options are, the problem is, even in India, the vegetarian snacks, they are also halal certified. So vegetarian food is not an option, I would say. I think the option is that the government has to make it mandatory that if any company is certifying that it is a halal product, it also has to simultaneously produce the non-halal certified product also, the non-halal product also. And until and unless they can produce both the things, they cannot take halal certification, and they cannot. And also the volume of the production also has to be seen, because interestingly, the if you look at a country like India or even US, so Muslims are a minority basically, but 18 to 20, 18% of the production is which is supposed to be done for 82% of the population and consumed by the rest 18%. The reverse is happening. I'll tell you a very interesting thing. Till a few years ago, and you look at all the major world economies now, including India, the share of halal products was 20%, and the share of non-halal products is 80%. Uh, the share of non-halal products is 80%. Sorry, the share of non-halal products was 80%, and share of halal products was 20%. But now the share of halal products is 80%, and the share of non-halal products is 20%. So this is the situation right now. So one has to look at first, and list the companies and the products which are being produced under the garb of basically halal certification, and which are being thrust on us, which are being pushed on us. That is what is we need to. The first and the foremost thing is that there is a lack of transparency. That is the most dangerous. And it is not only that the ironically, had there been only the companies which are owned by Muslims or Islamic organizations, no, large number of companies, rather most of the companies which are producing these products, so they are non-Islamic, but just to get enhance their corporate profits, so they are doing it, and now it has become a norm, and they are doing it in a very hush hush manner. Nobody's openly now. You must have seen hundreds of advertisements which come. Why don't they say that it's a halal certified product? They can simply put a disclaimer on that. Why shouldn't they be doing that? So I think that's the, and it is just the beginning. I think it's going to be a very long haul if we have to take this issue to the logical conclusion.
Yeah, see, the endpoint consumer generally doesn't understand the difference generally. Even if they are the religious Hindus, some of them may understand, but they generally don't understand. So I think it's the duty of the retailers to create a separate section where only these type of products are kept. And if it becomes mandated by the agencies, then I think it's very easy. But I'm talking about government agencies. But if the consumers of the, if the there is no law such like that, all the religiously religious products, I would call them religious products, if they are kept in a separate section, then automatically their market decreases. But because they are merged with other
Yeah.
products, so I think that's a simple law that can be created for that, and that's the same thing we can demand in the US also. Now, coming back to the religious duties, how does it affect the spiritual duties of Hindus or
See, it
other
affects the
non-Muslims?
see, one is that as you had pointed out, that it has been a product basically, kind of which has been used by somebody else. And second thing is that these are the products basically, it's against all the religious norms, because we don't have a differentiation of, you are taking, let's say, a packet of incense with you, or you are taking, let's say, some, you know, desi ghee with you, which is a halal product, and that you are basically, worshipping your deity with that. So that is almost like, committing sacrilege, because halal products are not allowed in Hinduism, and you are using the same products to worship your deity. So I think this is how your spiritual practices also, not only rituals, because but your spiritual practices also, get, because there is a certain piousness of the products which has to be there when you worship your deity, or before you, let's say, that you start, your spiritual practices. And when you are using an impure product according to your own religious considerations, so I think it's a great dent on the faith also. And it's very sad. I think it really affects, the spiritual practices and the religious norms, and it is very offensive. It offends, basically, anybody who would come to know will feel very offended about it.
Yeah, there's one more aspect. You said many countries' names and many European countries and South Americans also. So when it comes to the matters of food, so in most of the other countries and even in India also, food is a right, and generally laws and taxes are very less on food items. But there are non-food items also you mentioned, like toothpaste and other things which are just for. So what is the logic behind putting that certification on those kind of items?
The logic behind putting on this certification is one, that it's actually, uh, they are trying to create an Islamic market, and they're trying to create an Islamic grip on the global market. That is why all the products, they are basically taken into this list of halal certification. As I mentioned earlier, that in if you look at the theocratic states, Islamic theocratic states, you will find that there it is mandatory that you have to get all the products certified. So that's whether it is eatable or whether it is non-eatable. Because as I mentioned earlier, that in Islam, all it halal and haram, these two concepts are not related to any product or any particular product. These are related to, these are the core concepts of Islam. That whether it is an activity, leave apart the product, whether it is an activity, for example, taking interest on loans which you have given to somebody, so that is considered to be haram. So it's a very wider network, and it is about the Sharia. So wherever they establish this Sharia rule, or so I would look at it as a larger part of establishing an ummah, a global Islamic state and Islamic trade. So the first and the foremost and important thing is, as we all know, that it is not the politics which governs the economy now. It is the economy which governs the politics. So if the global trade is done according to the rules and regulations of Islamic Sharia, so you can understand the impact which it will have in the long run in terms of turning this world into an ummah, which has been their kind of objective. So that is how we have to look at it.
Many times I have seen that the followers of dharma, when they should be proactive, they're actually usually reactive, and they always react after the fact, and they don't think ahead many times, which is exactly the reverse of what is being taught in Ramayana and Mahabharata. You know, Yudhishthir was very proactive, even though he was very obedient, but he was proactive. In the war, it has been seen. And also in Ramayana, also, Bhagwan Ram took a proactive action. And Ravan had never dreamt of fighting with monkeys, but he did. He ended up fighting with monkeys and got defeated by them too. That proactivism has been lost. And generally, we see that the only being reactive and complaining doesn't help. You're just fighting after the fact. So what, as a community, that Hindus, especially non Abrahamic faith communities, should do to actually control these kind of elements? Because if the good people are not taking proactive steps, the bad people are naturally going to work on their own nature. Did you hear my question?
That is why we continue to face these kind of issues that we as
Arunji, we missed out most
I
of
think
the. We missed
there
out
is
your
one big
question.
challenge which this whole world is facing, and that is that we are not fighting only.
We missed out on the whole answer. Can you repeat?
Okay,
Yeah.
I'll just start again on this thing, and that there is a problem. We second is I
Arunji,
think
sorry to interrupt you.
there is a bigger problem also.
Sorry to interrupt you. Can you repeat the answer again? Because again there is a lag. Can't hear you.
Yeah. Okay, can you hear me now?
Y- Yes, we can hear you, but your image is frozen.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now I can hear you.
My image is frozen.
Yes.
I think largely there is also an issue that this world is frankly run by a big military industrial complex, and they're out there only for profits. And when along with what you call the Abrahamic religions, and with all these people, when they join hands, it becomes a very formidable, opposition. So it will take time, but I think I'm hopeful that at least we are talking about. I've been, uh, in journalism for almost 2.5 decades. I have never had seen such debates happening, which have started happening over the last 4 or 5 years, or especially last 6, 7 years, 10 years. So I'm very hopeful now that we are also realizing, and I think half the deed is done when we realize we have committed mistakes. And now I think in days to come, but the lesson for the non-Abrahamic or communities which suffer because of these things is never let your guard down. And a certain section of people, like probably what you are doing, so instead of thinking about their own personal or vested interests and their profits and their comfortable life, and there would always be only 1 to 2% of such people in a society, but they are more than sufficient. All we need is to have basically 2% of the people in the society dedicating themselves to the cause. So in India we have like RSS, and where they have reached, probably can be worked out at rest of the places also. But it is important first to create awareness, second talk on facts, and third then create a wider opinion consensus on this. And that can only be done through debates and discussions, and more and more sharing more and more correct information to the people, while also being open to suggestions and criticism, because nobody can be can claim to be the gospel. So I think that is the kind of atmosphere which we have to create. It will help us to get more and more people to come with us.
No, great point, Arunanandji. Now, one of the things which I see generally a, a ideological weakness, especially in the Hindus, because most of them do not read their own books, religious books. I would say scientific books like Bhagavad Gita is a science, not a religion. Now, when they don't read those kind of books and rely on Western authors to tell them something, or even the leftist Indian authors to tell them about their own book, don't you think that that creates a weakness of identity in their hearts? And then these kind of things cannot notice. A person like you, who has been a journalist and who understands your culture through intelligence, like through reading books and other literatures. But most of the Indians don't do that. And when they go to platforms like Wikipedia and Quora, which is just a propaganda tools of some other groups, and they're completely distorting the facts. So the only recourse for Indians is to either create their own large media platforms, or just like we have done Sathology.org, which is we have done, or something like that, more similar coming out, which can actually talk about these kind of things in a documented scientific way. Because you, people like you and us, we are all humans. We miss certain things, we see certain things. There is a limitation obviously there, but on the opposite side is highly organized setup, and they are working proactively. They find out new creative ways, and somehow we have to also get out of the reactive mode and create new creative ways to see their strategy is to make everyone like them in faith. We should also have a strategy to make them also like us in faith. Then only there will be a motivation to be proactive. What do you think?
I agree with you. No, I think the one of the major challenges which I have realized that we have plethora of knowledge, but the challenge is basically how to repackage. So packaging and repackaging are not the words which I really prefer to use, but they convey the right meaning to the common people. See, for example, you talked about Bhagavad Gita. Now there are number of other texts also. We have Upanishads, we have you know other Vedic texts, we have Purans. So what we need to do is we need to package it in a format and bring it to the common people so that they can understand it. Unfortunately, because of the almost I would say the extinction of Sanskrit language, because it didn't remain the language of the common people, and most of our ancient texts are in Sanskrit. So, what we have been doing actually, we have been reading translations of these texts, which have been done by Westerners. For example, you take the case of Max Muller. Now, 19th and 20th century, Max Muller was considered to be a doyen of Vedic knowledge because he had translated Vedas. But there is a documentary evidence that he was hired by the Britishers to learn Sanskrit and then interpret Vedic literature in such a way and translate Vedas in such a way that they appear to be, almost basically useless. So this is what he did. He said two good things about Vedas and then rest basically kind of almost trashed them. And he has accepted that. He's on record accepting this, that he came here with a purpose. And for us, Max Muller is a god. So we also have to see that this is also another challenge, that how we can go back to the ancient texts. Do not rely on, the don't have to. I'm not trashing all the translations. Some of them are definitely very good and done with the right intention. But until and unless we do that, that is what I think needs to be done. And then we can actually uh, take the right kind of knowledge to, and it's a long process. And the governments have to play an important role in it, and most importantly, the society has to play an important role in it, and encourage and support people who are taking such endeavor.
So the word Sathology is like repackaging. So we are saying mythology. When we say mythology, then mythology means a lie or fake or imagination. But when we say Sathology,
Yeah.
it is science of truth. So instead of mythology, we call Ramayana, Mahabharata, Ved, Upanishad, Purana as Sathology. Now, so we have just changed the adjective. We have not changed the scriptures. But my experience is I've been teaching Bhagavad Gita in US for last 27 years. And I have been consistently sharing the knowledge of Bhagavad Gita with everyone here in this country. There is a huge acceptance because that's the only book which doesn't talk about a community. It talks about a soul. So virtually Bhagavad Gita is a very simple conversation between four people, and it conveys a plethora of information about spirituality, and it's the only book of spirituality, very well received by Americans. In fact, in America, the organizations like ISKCON, they have sold more than 70 to 80 million books just in US. And I think their numbers are going to reach 250 million in next 5 years. And that's a and they have only one major publication, which is Bhagavad Gita, which is the popular one, as it is they call it. Now, the it's a matter of simplification. So we have Hindus have the most well documented culture on the planet, multiple books, multiple histories, multiple viewpoints. But in those 745 shloka, everything has been summarized. So when we talk about giving identity to people, and we say, when we tell Americans, because Americans generally, or other Europeans and Western countries, even South Americans, they tend to oversimplify things, very much oversimplify. But when we talk about the soul, they are all united. And then they have the ears for Bhagavad Gita. And I think what is your viewpoint on just following Shankaracharya? Adi Shankaracharya says, "Let there be only one book, Bhagavad Gita." He said it, and for the entire mankind. So when we present like that, makes it simple. And just like uh, if you want to go to a store and you want to buy a certain thing, and you tell them what you want, but if you don't know what you want, then you have confusion there because stores are so huge nowadays, and you can go in any section of the store. So what is your viewpoint on that?
I think there are two things. One is that I am you are right that of course Bhagavad Gita uh, is one book which is more than sufficient. because it is, and it's the best part about Bhagavad Gita is that it is understandable to everybody, and it also has something for everybody. My personal experience has been that if I would say, in the modern terminology, it is the best GPS which you can have
Exactly.
for anything you do in your life. So it's basically like that. Any page you open, and you wouldn't, you will find a way forward to any of your problems or some this thing. Also, I think Bhagavad Gita helps to bring a certain sense of dispassionate ness in you, and or a detachment, what you call. And I think that's very important, because there is what we have seen in Corona, during Corona. I think I also look at, I'm bringing this thing in because it's everybody's talking about it. The overindulgence of human society in everything. So I would say, nature also has a way of setting things right. We should also look at it, these things. I can tell you about India and some of the other countries. Not much aware about what happened in US, but I believe the dolphins were back near the shores. The flowers which we thought that have become extinct started blooming again. The birds which we thought had become extinct, and which never used to be there in the urban areas, especially, so we saw them again. Nature has its own way of getting back. So this overindulgence, Bhagavad Gita is tells you basically that live with a sense of detachment and don't get overindulged. But most important thing is, the point is that how to read it is one thing, and second is how to practice it is another thing. Though I would say that Bhagavad Gita is the most easy practicing manual actually. You can learn by doing. It's learning by doing. So one thing is there, but I'm very hopeful and very positive about one aspect, that over the last 2 decades, many new spiritual, I won't say sects, but many new spiritual gurus and many new spiritual organizations have come up in India, and a large number of, and they are expanding globally, whether it is Art of Living or whether it is Sadhguru, and the core of their teachings is largely based on Bhagavad Gita. So and the spiritual practices are also largely based on Bhagavad Gita, and the youth are especially joining them in large numbers, and practicing whatever is being taught. That in days to come, I think it's. I'll just give you an example. Yuval Noah Harari, who has written this beautiful book called 21 Lessons for 21st Century. So in the first 20 chapters, he talks about the challenges or the problems which are there in front of the world. And the last chapter, 21st chapter, the title of the chapter is meditation. So this is what is happening in the world now. So they are accepting it, and I think that is the only way forward. And Bhagavad Gita has to be the beacon of light.
Thank you, Arunanandji. It's a pleasure, always a pleasure to talk to you. You are a wealth of information and knowledge, and I think you touched upon a very important topic today, which affects many people in their religious duties. And it's always the attempt of Sathology to bring out facts and convey it to a larger audience. And for viewers who could not watch it live, it was a live session. So please watch it on YouTube, subscribe it, share it with your friends, and learn more. We have very exciting academic content only for the students, and students means everyone is a student. So please keep watching and keep coming back. We'll have Arunanji back with some other interesting topic. Namaskar. Thank you.
Namaskar.